War is a terrible thing. The displacement of the downtrodden in favour of those with more wealth is something that should be frowned upon, yet the need to be superior is ever present within the human race. The harsh reality is that perhaps on some level we are all selfish, self-centered beings who benefit from the suffering of others. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, developed by CD Projekt Rd and distributed across Windows, Sony PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One in 2015, takes a look at what life is like after the invasion of a country has taken place. The rich tread over the corpses of the poor with not as much as a second glance. It's dark and dire, as glum as can be, yet try as you might, you'll not be able to turn away. For the purposes of this review, I played the base game on PC on the Sword and Story difficulty. Once again, we are placed in the shoes of the Witcher Geralt, a mutant human who specializes in slaying monsters for a price. The game opens as Geralt and his mentor Vesemir are pursuing rumours of a sighting of Geralt's long-lost lover Yennefer, who is said to be among the Nilfgaard army. After spending some time in the province of White Orchid, Geralt finally locates the raven-haired woman. Eluding the wild hunt, the two travel to Vizima, where Geralt learns that the girl he raised, Ciri, has been sighted at multiple locations across the continent. Thus begins the search for the missing girl, in a bid to reunite his family. One thing that I found tedious about this game was its similarity to the situations the protagonists of Terry Goodkind's Sword of Truth series found themselves in. When separated, Richard and Callan always seemed to just miss meeting each other, which was very frustrating. The same thing happens time and time again in what pads out The Witcher 3 by having you go to locations where Ciri was seen, only to arrive after she has already departed. Whilst the ultimate goal is to find her, you probably won't until you're at least 50 to 60 hours into the game. If you intend to play The Witcher 3, you'd best be prepared to be in it for the long haul. Upon the game's initial release, it was critically acclaimed, and it's not difficult to see why. There is a rich narrative interwoven throughout. Taking on a Witcher contract, which would have just seen you locating and killing a monster in a previous title, now has you talking with NPCs, using your Witcher's sense to follow trails and find clues, and sometimes you are even given the option to spare a foe rather than slay it. This dynamic construct of the narrative ensures that you'll always be hungering for more, no matter what point of the game you're at. Though if you are like me, you may find yourself burnt out if you try to do it all. Many of the characters that you have grown to love in previous games make a return, which helped invest me into the world. I was always excited when I ran into an old acquaintance or a friend, and interested to see how they were faring in this newly war-torn world. You'll be surprised to discover that some characters that formerly held power are now at the mercy of the hands of those they once subjected. A key example was that in The Witcher 2, I saved Sheila from being torn apart when she was escaping through a portal, and despite her escaping in one piece, due to the rampant witch hunts in Novigrad, you'll discover her in a dungeon barely clinging to life, the only options being to walk away or give her a clean death, her health too far gone to be able to do anything to help. Some of these moments were very impactful, and it was sad to see how much the world had changed. Another example would be that I was eagerly looking forward to meeting Kalkstein, only to find out that it had already been burnt at the stake weeks prior to me arriving in Novigrad. Much of the game is darkness, the festering side of humanity that rankles with jealousy, and the undying need to extirpate those underfoot in a bid to remain turned away from the mirror, whose reflective surface would reveal the truth of the demons that inhabit our corrupted flesh. Unlike contemporaries like the Mass Effect series, which uses a Paragon and Renegade dialogue option system, The Witcher 3 is morally grey. Many times, the choices you are presented with may have a negative consequence regardless of the option selected. You could try to play as a morally just Geralt, but things won't always turn out lilacs and gooseberries. Appeasing one person may piss off another, which can have consequences later in the game. A prime example was that I decided to free a spirit that was trapped inside a tree. After I completed this task, they promised they would free orphans that were trapped in a nearby bog. When I returned to the bog, the orphans were nowhere to be found. What's more, a nearby village that had once provided their severed ears to the ladies of the bog had been entirely slaughtered to the last. It's times like these that you wonder what good your choices are when someone inevitably is going to come to harm no matter what you do. In addition to the main scenario quests, which are necessary to complete the game, there are also secondary quests which can affect the future of the game's narrative should you wish to complete them. For example, in my playthrough I chose to forbid Ciri Metz from taking plague research and giving it to King Radovid. As soon as I told her no, she decided to whip herself into a frenzy and attack me. As I had no choice but to defend myself, she ended up dead. Sadly, due to this altercation, she wasn't able to present herself to assist in a battle later in the game. Sometimes, depending on where you are in the story, secondary quests may also cancel each other out. If you complete one, you are not able to complete the other, so you must choose which ones to do wisely. Additionally, there are Witcher contracts, which as mentioned before can become more than just slaying a monster, and treasure hunts, which see Geralt searching for bounties based on clues and keys that he finds along his travels. Thankfully, you never need to fear becoming lost, as the map will always give you an indication of the general area of the quest objective and how to get there, which I thought was handy. The continent's version of GPS always kept me on track, except in instances where I was required to head into a network of caves, like those sometimes found in Skellige. The continent is a vast and dangerous place with many wonders and dangers to stumble upon. Whilst you could heedlessly run out into the wilderness, which may result in an untimely death at the claws of a monster that outranks you in level, you can also read up on local lore using notice boards that exist within most of the main settlements. By reading a notice board, not only can you gain access to Witcher contracts, but you'll also have your map populated with nearby places of interest that will appear as question marks. It's then up to you to decide as to whether or not you want to take a gamble and see what they are. Sometimes they are guarded treasure, sometimes monster nests, sometimes a place of power, and others an entire network of caves. In the beginning, I enjoyed going out of my way to find these, but eventually I found myself straying less and less from my path, as the number of hours I sank into the game continued to grow well beyond the amount of time I would usually put into a game. Ultimately, many of these don't provide rewards that are worth going out of your way for, so it's really up to you as to whether or not you want to do them. As Geralt is a Witcher and by occupation it's his given duty to dispatch monsters, you will find yourself in combat more often than not. There is a much wider array of enemies compared to the previous titles, which I found refreshing. In addition to monsters, Geralt may sometimes have to take out humans who provide a threat to his existence. Geralt possesses 2 swords to dispatch his foes with, one silver and one steel. Each sword can also be swung into a light, more agile attack, or a slower, heavier hitting, strong attack. Comboing these together can see Geralt dancing through the battlefield as though he were at a masquerade ball, sometimes concluding with a gruesome finisher. When a blade alone cannot bite flesh, Geralt also has his Witcher signs to fall back on. There are 5 signs in total, all of which have their uses this time around. Rd is for throwing enemies and breaking environmental objects. Igni is for setting foes and sometimes the environment alight. Iridan is for setting traps that are particularly useful at drawing wraiths into their physical form. Axii is used not only in negotiation, but also to calm frantic animals or to manipulate the mind. And finally, Quen is the good old trusty protection spell. Whilst I enjoyed that there were uses for every sign this time around, even though you have the ability to level up and allocate skill points, combat eventually just became an exercise of swinging your blade around until all the enemies were dead. I felt that there was no strategy involved, at least on the sword and story difficulty, but even giving the enemies more health and making them do more damage really wouldn't change the core of the combat system, which I feel needs something more if a future Witcher game is ever released. Dispatching enemies and completing objectives will grant Geralt experience points. Gather enough and he will level up. I should note the quests are all assigned levels, and if your level is higher than the level of the quest you are undertaking, you will only gain a fraction of the experience. In some instances I found that completing a quest wasn't even worth the experience rewarded, which was a shame. When Geralt levels up, he is able to spend an ability point in one of 4 skill trees: swordsmanship, signs, alchemy, and other. Unlike previous titles however, simply spending an ability point does not grant the properties of the ability unlocked. All abilities need to be equipped in order to become functional. There is a limited number of skill slots available to Geralt, which gradually become more as he levels up. The maximum though is 12, with the ability to equip up to 4 mutagens that can further increase your abilities. I didn't like this restrictive system, and would have preferred the system used in the previous 2 games. Additionally, the game was never difficult enough to require me to use potions, so I never invested into that skill tree at all. Regarding potions, generally speaking, in previous games the Swallow Potion was invaluable to ensuring that you could survive combat by regenerating your health as you fought. In The Witcher 3, however, health can be regenerated by consuming food, or by meditating, on lower difficulties, completely eliminating the need to use the Swallow Potion. Also, Geralt can use sub-items such as the torch, which meant that I never needed to use a cat potion either. Overall, I was a little disappointed by the system, as there was more of a necessity to rely on potions in the previous games. For example, I don't think I'd have been able to beat the Golden Dragon at the end of The Witcher 2 if I didn't use potions. I never, even for some of the bosses, had to consider a strategy in The Witcher 3. In fact, I never died through combat when playing as Geralt either. At some points in the game you'll be required to play as Ciri, who controls differently to Geralt in that she only has one sword and no spells. I enjoyed that the game had variety in this regard, however Ciri has no easy way to regenerate her health, so if you are not careful it's easy to find yourself getting a game over. She has the ability to teleport around the field, which was handy for dodging, but when using it as an attack sometimes the enemy could still strike her, even when she wasn't present within reality. Also, there was one section in the game which really frustrated me. You're told you need to infiltrate a building via a balcony, and in the distance is a high-rise cathedral which looks like your end goal. Some of the roofs look like they needed to be jumped across, but try as I might, Ciri always ended up falling to her death. Then I realised that she was already near to where she needed to go, and just had to drop from the roof onto the balcony below. I kind of wish that this would have been made a bit more clearer. Where Ciri has the ability to teleport even to other dimensions, Geralt isn't so lucky, and he is even more prone to death by falling. I can't tell you the number of times I was exploring and jumped down a little ledge, only to find myself facing the game over screen. So Geralt can face adversaries as an everyday human couldn't even begin to comprehend, but a little drop is enough to cripple him? Maybe there should be a shin splinting potion. For moving quickly around the continent, The Witcher 3 does utilise a fast travel system, however it cannot be accessed unless Geralt is at a signpost. So if you're stuck out in the wilds, tough luck. You're going to have to use conventional means of travel. This was a negative for me, as there are other games that have vast worlds that let you fast travel at will. By restricting this system, it needlessly added time to the game's clock. Geralt can also ride his trusty horse Roach across the landscape, who can easily be summoned to you by pressing L3 twice. For great bodies of water, Geralt can either swim, where he also has the ability to dive, or he can take a boat. Both methods are slow going though, and Geralt will become vulnerable to attacks, especially in Skellige. Thankfully, Geralt can use a portable crossbow in situations where he must face enemies underwater. For some reason, it's able to one-shot enemies that are beneath the waves, but only merely damage them a little on land, though I suppose if it didn't one-shot underwater, it would have been frustrating as hell. I hated continuously being pulled down by drowners, when you were just trying to explore and find a treasure and trying not to drown. Geralt will be given opportunities to romance the various women of the continent throughout his adventure, though the main love interests are Yennefer and Triss. You can either go for one or the other, or risk ire by romancing both. As my Geralt was in it for Triss from the beginning, I just stuck to romancing her, which did have a nice payoff in the end. Nudity in this game is not flaunted about as readily as it was in the first game, which I was relieved to see. Not to say that it doesn't exist, because it does, but this time around it's in a more tasteful and artistic way, rather than random women's breasts being shoved in my face for the pure fact that the developers had the freedom to do so. In addition to the normal story tasks and combat, Geralt has other activities that he can undertake to pass the time. If you feel like fighting unarmed, Geralt can take part in boxing tournaments. Unfortunately, it was a simple process of just button mashing until you won. Alternatively, there's also horse racing, which pits Geralt and Roach against opponents on a predetermined track. This is a great way to get equipment for Roach, but again, it wasn't that difficult. The only race I lost was the one in Kaer Morhen, on the final turn into the keep. The final activity of notice is the card game Gwent. Initially I was frustrated by it as the opponent always seemed to win. However, if you do buy all the cards you find from the merchants and win against lesser opponents first, it's possible to build up a deck so that victory becomes reachable. It became such a time sink for me as I was determined to collect every card that I could. In fact, the card game itself is so popular that it spawned a free-to-play standalone which can be accessed on Steam. Maybe I'll check that out someday. From the stormy fields of the war-ravaged Velen to the sweeping vistas of the Skellige Isles, the game is teeming with beautiful details. I loved how intimately crafted the environments were and always marvelled at the wonderful sights I was presented with. Sure, sometimes the game gives you gritty, dirty and dark locations, but the next moment you'll be exploring an old elven ruin that oozes beauty. All the locations felt fully realised and lived in, and there wasn't any place that was inhabited that felt bare, as some games are wont to do. The UI interface is non-intrusive and would sometimes disappear from the screen in non-combat scenarios, allowing you to drink in the environments at your own leisure. The musical score was conducted by Marcin Subowovic, and I'm sorry if I butchered that, who did a wonderful job of creating tracks that were both atmospheric and also appropriate for the situations that Geralt found himself in. From the sombre track of the Velen area where the hope of the people is but a distant memory, to the Nordic influence tracks of the Skellige Isles, I always found myself pleasantly surprised by the music that accompanied Geralt on his lonely journey. My favourite track is called Ain Shay, and I'm pretty sure I've probably butchered that as well, I'm sorry, which has a hint of the Lodge of the Sorceress theme from The Witcher 2. When the woman's voice comes in wailing, it feels like it's embodying the anger of the sorceresses that had needlessly lost their lives to the machination of kings and kingmakers. The track mainly plays when you're exploring elven ruins with the sorceress in tow, so it also conveys the sorrow of the elves who have lost their great kingdoms. The voice acting for the game is perfection, and it permeates the entire game. Outside of scripted dialogue, you can be running down the street, hearing the chatter of those around you, whether it be directed at Geralt or not. I believe the voice acting really helped to bring the characters alive, especially Yennefer, whose cold visage only slipped one time, which was when she reunited with Ciri, and I really appreciated that moment. Whilst The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt does have a strong narrative going for it, it also has numerous distractions that detract from this and make it easier to just put the game down in exhaustion. If I wasn't playing it to review it, I definitely would have given up without completing it. In fact, at the time of publishing this review, according to Steam's achievement database, only 26.5% of all people who have this game in their library and have started it have actually finished it. That really says a lot. Almost 75% of people that picked up the game have not bothered to finish it for one reason or another. Yes, the game has a lot going for it, and it definitely deserved the accolades it received. However, I felt like the previous titles did it better in terms of keeping the game's narrative on track. If you do like exploring off the beaten path, and are fine with there being long pauses between story beats, then this game is for you. If you are easily distracted, then oh look, a dragon! By the way, as I mentioned previously, I wouldn't have finished this game if it wasn't for me reviewing it. Before I started reviewing games, there have been many that I put down and simply didn't finish. Are there any games that you have put down for whatever reason, and what was that reason? Let me know in the comments. This has been Venoir with a review of the base game of The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt for the PC. If you enjoyed this review, please feel free to like and subscribe for more Western RPG content. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all again next time. Take care of yourselves, and bye bye for now.